Welcome to this episode of Capital and Country. In this episode, I discuss the Yoorrook Justice Commission and what led me to writing a letter to the King. We go through a deadly Blak reading list posted by VOUGE Australia, and we discuss NITA's leading the next generation. The first story, Australia at a crossroads, confronting genocide, committing to truth. Australia is living through a moment as fraught as it is urgent. The Yoorrook Justice Commission, Victoria's first Indigenous-led truth-telling inquiry, has laid bare a devastating conclusion that genocide was committed against First Nations people throughout the colony and state since 1834. Massacres, disease, sexual violence, cultural erasure, and forced child removals decimated communities. By 1901, Victorian Aboriginal populations may have fallen to a haunting 1 to 5% of pre-contact numbers. Coordinated action aimed at destruction of the social and cultural foundations of First Peoples. So I just want to go through the Commission's report to discuss some of the findings in more detail and some of the recommendations. I think this part of the report, given later my letter to King Charles III, it's worth just touching on this. So while Victoria wrestled with its own responsibilities, another silence settled like moss on old stone. In October 2024, King Charles III visited Australia for the first time as sovereign, the first reigning monarch to do so since 2011. In February of that year, Yoorrook wrote to His Majesty inviting him to meet with the Commission during his tour. Has described the potential engagement as a historic opportunity, a chance for the Crown to address its legacy of dispossession, violence, and cultural theft, to acknowledge the suffering inflicted by imperial acts, and to support the repatriation of First Peoples artefacts and remains from the United Kingdom. The Commission drew on a long history of petitions to the Crown, including William Cooper's 1938 appeal to King George V, which called on the British monarch to intervene in the treatment of Aboriginal people in Australia. Cooper's petition was never passed on by the Australian government. History, it seemed, was being repeated. The King did not take up the offer to meet with the Commission. In the weeks following the King's visit to Australia, Commissioner Lovett was invited to Camp Sovereignty, a long-standing protest site at King's Domain in Melbourne. There, under the steady flame of a ceremonial peacefire, Uncle Robbie Thorpe reflected on the importance of truth, place, and unfinished justice. Once an Aboriginal reserve, the site stands as a reminder that sovereignty was never ceded. Uncle Robbie called for the renaming of the site and for the establishment of a First People Cultural Interpretation Centre. Truth made permanent and immovable. In the context of me writing a letter, it doesn't bode well for a reply from King Charles, but I think these are the types of things, if us as a country remain under the banner of the British monarch and as a colony, why should the head of the state not know about this, not know about the findings? And so I think that the more we can get things in front of him and his family, put the pressure on a little bit, the more likely it is that we're going to end up with, potentially some sort of result or some acknowledgement. But we wait with bated breath. I'm not sure that there's going to be too much of an outcome there. Now, I think the outcome of the report is really important. So the Yoorrook's inquiry revealed not only how systems had failed or been designed to fail, but also how First Peoples' culture and knowledges had endured despite every attempt to suppress them. The evidence presented to Yoorrook consistently revealed how present-day systematic injustices faced by First Peoples are deeply rooted in the colonial foundations of the state of Victoria. Invasion and the colonial laws and policies that followed it were predicated on beliefs of racial superiority. The systemic racism that persists today has its origins in colonial systems and institutions. By sharing these truths, Yoorrook helped the broader Victorian community see the connections between history and contemporary injustice. Understanding these links are essential to building a new kind of relationship, one forged in honesty, accountability, and justice. Yoorrook's recommendations were carefully designed to facilitate proposals for systematic change, including reforms to laws, institutions, and public systems. Many of these were intended to be taken up through treaty negotiations, while others pointed to an immediate action the state could take to begin redressing injustice. Each marked a step towards a different future, one in which truth is not hidden and justice is not postponed. All reforms were underpinned by a call for self-determination. Over its 4 years of operation, Yoorrook produced 3 reports spanning 8 volumes, addressing systematic reforms needed across its area of inquiry. The first interim report, Yoorrook with Purpose, was delivered in June 2022, providing an overview of Yoorrook's progress, including the initial challenges it faced during its establishment. It outlined Yoorrook's methodology, centering First Nations people in Victoria in the Commission's processes. It made just 2 recommendations based on what was critical to complete the Commission's work successfully. Firstly, it recommended that the Victorian government provide a 2-year extension of time for Yoorrook to deliver its final report. Given the enormity of its mandate, the complexity involved in establishing and operating in a culturally safe and trauma-informed way, and in recognition of the time lost to COVID-19 lockdowns during its first year. Secondly, the Commission recommended that the government urgently legislate to protect Indigenous data sovereignty. In 2023, the government responded by granting a 12-month extension of time to 30th of June 2025, and committing to reform to address protections of First Nations evidence. In September 2022, Yoorrook commenced its inquiry into Victoria's child protection and criminal justice system. During its public hearing, the Commission heard accounts of the removal of Aboriginal children from their families and how the criminalisation of resistance to dispossession were state-sanctioned colonial practices in the lands now known as Victoria. It heard heart-wrenching accounts of families being torn apart, together with powerful stories of survival, cultural strength, and revival. First Peoples, witnesses, and organisations emphasised the critical need for self-determination in the child protection and criminal justice system. These truths, together with 46 recommendations for reform, were presented in Yoorrook's report, Yoorrook for Justice, report into Victoria's child protection and criminal justice systems, tabled in the Victorian Parliament on the 4th of September 2023. On the 3rd of April 2024, the Victorian government formally responded to Yoorrook's recommendation for reform. The Commission was disappointed that the government accepted just 28 of the 46 recommendations in full or in principle, and committed to considering 15 more. 3 recommendations were not supported. In October 2024, the Victorian government reported its progress implementing these recommendations. Progress has been made on several recommendations, and it now supports a further 3 recommendations previously under consideration. Starting in October 2023, Yoorrook focused its inquiry on injustice against First Peoples in relation to land, sky, and waters. Yoorrook gathered an unprecedented body of evidence about justice, right violations, and other harms experienced by First Peoples in relation to their lands and waters, together with recommendations for reform. From May to June 2024, Yoorrook also held hearings to gather evidence about health, housing, education, and economic injustices experienced by First Peoples. The Commission heard how racism and discrimination had infiltrated and embedded itself within these systems, which were not designed for or by Aboriginal people. Yoorrook's recommendations relating to these inquiries into land, sky and waters, health, housing, education, economic injustice and access to records are contained in its final interim report, Yoorrook for Transformation. So what are the key findings? The Yoorrook Justice Commission was established in 2021, mandate with broad and far-reaching, including reporting on historical and ongoing systematic injustices experienced by First People in Victoria. Over 1,300 submissions, evidence from more than 250 witnesses across 65 hearing days, as well as 67 roundtables and yarning circles. Yoorrook has delivered 3 interim reports that examined and identified the causes and consequences of systematic injustices. All major political parties, whether in government or in opposition, have perpetuated and compounded the trauma, injustice, and suffering of First Nations people. Yoorrook's findings are not the result of evidence from First Nations alone. Over the course of the inquiry, Yoorrook received evidence from First Peoples, including elders, traditional owners, and community-controlled organisations. But the Commission also received evidence from the Premier, ministers, public servants, historians, healthcare workers, educators, other service providers, religious leaders, descendants, and everyday Victorians. The consistent and overwhelming theme of this evidence is that the legacy of colonisation is still manifest in every aspect of life, including the current day overrepresentation of First Peoples in the criminal justice and child protection systems, and in the inequitable outcomes in health and well-being, housing, employment, education, economic and political life. First Peoples have demonstrated that with secure access to their lands, waters and resources, they are better able to provide for the social, economic and cultural needs of their community than government or industry. Yoorrook's key findings draw from the conclusions presented in the Commission's existing reports, but are limited in the number in order to highlight the key events in Victoria's colonial history that underpin the systematic injustice facing First Peoples in Victoria today. So I just wanted to touch on some of the key findings. I probably won't go through all of them. The first one here is the land now known as Victoria was not discovered by the British Crown or founded by settlers. And I think it's worth probably putting a bit of a caveat on all of these. And for most listeners, this will come as fairly fairly standard language that we all, know and agree upon and can stare at and say, yeah, well, that makes complete sense. But I think that, the Yoorrook Justice Commission, what it does is it memorializes this in quite a legitimate way. And so, a lot of this will probably just look at and go, oh, well, we know this, but it is worth just, tempering our thoughts with that. So First People have been caring for country in Victoria for at least tens of thousands of years. Pre-colonisation, Victoria was home to about 60,000 First Peoples, comprising 300 to 500 clan groups and speaking over 40 First Peoples languages. The second one, the sovereignty of First Peoples in Victoria has never been ceded and continues to exist. First Peoples exercised sovereignty before the British invaded. From time immemorial, Victorian First Peoples have practiced their law, cared for their communities, families and children, and nurtured country through their spiritual, cultural, material and economic connections to the land, water and resources. It is the first law of this country. First Peoples' sovereignty reflects ongoing spiritual and ancestral ties between the land, waters and traditional owners. First Peoples' sovereignty has not been lawfully acquired under international law. This is because the purported settlement or occupation of Australia by the British cannot be validly relied upon as country was already occupied. It was not terra nullius, that is, land belonging to no one. The initial occupation of land, now known as Victoria, by European settlers from 1834 onwards was illegal, rapid, and largely uncontrolled. After the initial settlement of Gujamara country in 1834, colonisers rushed to seize highly valuable grazing land and waters across the state, even when it was contrary to the laws of the colonial government. The discovery of gold in 1851 triggered another rapid increase in the population, with devastating consequences for First Peoples and their lands and waters. The taking of country and resources was violent, as First Peoples were displaced and massacred by European settlers in the pursuit of their land and waters. By the end of the 1860s, there had been at least 50 recorded massacres across Victoria, in which just 8 colonists were killed compared to 978 First Peoples. It is highly likely that this violence was significantly under-recorded. Correspondence between colonial authorities in Victoria and the British Imperial government reported on the scale of the violence and the significant threat to First Peoples populations. The British Imperial government were aware of the gross abuses of First Peoples and failed to act or take any effective action to protect the First Peoples, their property or other rights. The colonial government of the day played both an active and passive role in violence, including massacres, killings, rapes and pillaging, in the 20 years that followed the arrival of Europeans in Victoria. The number of Victorian First Peoples is estimated to have dramatically reduced by more than 90% from 15,000 to just 1,900. Laws and policies of the British and colonial governments were used to authorise the confiscation, theft, use and damage of the lands and waters belonging to First People without their consent. Large pastoral estates established between 1836 and 1851 created the foundations for the accumulation of vast amounts of land and intergenerational wealth unavailable to First Peoples. By 1884, all First Peoples land and water had been divided and categorised, and First Peoples have been forcibly expelled from their lands and confined to smaller and smaller parcels of land through the reserve system over time. The Protection Acts and other related colonial laws and policies deliberately disrupted First Peoples' connections with their traditional lands and waters and each other, and by today's standards, a number of these actions would amount to genocidal acts. From the 1850s, First Peoples were forced into missions and reserves where they were monitored, punished, prohibited from speaking language and practicing culture, and were often Christianized. Control over First Peoples' lives intensified with the introduction of the Aborigines Protection Act 1869 VIC and its amendment and successor acts, including the Aborigines Protection Act 1886 VIC. The 1886 Act was used to keep Aboriginal natives on reserves and force people of mixed descent off reserve, so they could be absorbed into general community and eventually disappear. The Act marked the beginning of the stolen generations and was used to justify the removal of First Peoples children and the separation of families. The power of police to forcibly remove children under child welfare laws continued until 1985 through the Aborigines Act 1910 VIC and Aborigines Act 57 VIC, and subsequent legislation. These acts caused significant and irreversible harm to First Peoples of Victoria. So I'm not going to touch on the remaining ones in much detail, however, we'll read their lead lines. Victorian First Peoples have demonstrated remarkable resilience in maintaining their identity, connection to country and one another. None of the wealth generated from the land and waters of First Peoples in the period since colonisation in Victoria has been directly shared with traditional owners. Colonisation is not only a historic event, but a process that continues to affect First Peoples in Victoria today. There is an unbroken line between past atrocious government actions and the experience for First Peoples today. First Peoples in Victoria have a fundamental right to self-determination and a right to redress from the harms caused by colonisation. Treaty is the best pathway to self-determination and must include redress for the harm suffered as a result of colonisation. Redress under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is multidimensional and can include elements of restoration, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantee of non-repetition. So I just want to spend some time looking at Yoorrook's recommendations for immediate and lasting reform. They make 100 recommendations for transformative change, urgent action, and redress, including reforms relating to land, education, health, housing, economic and political life, and access to records, while Yoorrook for Justice makes 46 recommendations for reform across the criminal justice and child protective systems. So general recommendations. These recommendations address broad structural issues that affect many areas of life for First Peoples in Victoria. They include reforms related to treaty, self-determination, governance, and other cross-cutting issues that underpin justice and long-term change. Together they support a foundation for lasting transformation informed by the truth shared with the Commission. The first recommendation, the Victorian Government must transfer decision-making power, authority, control and resources to First Peoples given full effect to self-determination in Victorian child protection system. Transferring or creating decision-making power includes, but is not limited to, system design, obtaining and allocating resources, powers of and appointments to bodies or institutions, and accountability and oversight functions, including new First Peoples-led bodies, oversight processes, or complaints. The criminal justice system recommendations. The criminal justice system continues to disproportionately harm First Peoples in Victoria. Yoorrook's recommendations in this area call for transformative reform to address systematic racism, reduce over-policing and incarceration, and ensure that justice systems uphold the rights, dignity, and self-determination of Aboriginal people. These reforms reflect the truth shared with the Commission and aim to build a safer, fairer future for all. Recommendation 27, the Victorian Government must establish and adequately resource a new independent police oversight authority headed by a statutory officer who has not been a police officer. 2. A. Investigate and determine all complaints about police, except for minor customer service matters. B. Investigate and report on all police contact deaths and serious incidents. C. Conduct independent monitoring of and reporting on police custody and detention. D. On its own motion, monitor, audit, systemically review, and report on the exercise of police powers and interaction with the public, including customer service matters. E. Undertake own motion public interest investigations. And F. Publish reports in the public interest. The new authority must, G. Have powers to arrest, search property, and compel the production of information, including from the Victorian Police. And H. Include a dedicated division for complaints for First Peoples that are under First Peoples leadership. Land, Sky and Water Recommendation. Recommendation number 14. The Victorian Government must provide redress for First Peoples and their families affected by soldier settlement schemes, including A. An acknowledgement and apology by the Victorian Government to First Peoples affected by soldier settlement schemes and their families. B. Appropriate support for First Peoples affected by soldier settlement schemes and their families. And C. Redress, including land grants and or compensation. Education recommendation. Recommendation 47. Working with First Peoples, the Victorian Government must continue to ensure that ongoing sustainable funding is provided to First Peoples-led early education services, including to expand service delivery and meet demand for services. Health recommendation 70. Led by First Peoples, the Victorian Government must, working with the federal government where necessary, A. Increase funding to First Peoples-led health services to ensure they are sufficiently resourced to deliver First Peoples, regardless of where they live, a similar range of services, including material 1. Maternal and child health services. 2. Financial support programs for those struggling with cost of living and food security. And 3. Alcohol and drug services, including withdrawal and residential rehabilitation services. And B. Fund First Peoples-led organisations to deliver 1. A holistic range of aged care services, both residential and non-residential. And 2. Palliative care services. Economic prosperity recommendations. The Victorian Government must A. Revise the implementation timeline and proposed goals of the Yuma-Yamamboy strategy, including developing a publicly accessible monitoring and accountability plan for the strategy. B. Incentivise major corporations in Victoria's private sector to embed more First Peoples businesses in supply chains. C. Change procurement monitoring and targets for a number of contracts to total dollars spent to accurately reflect investment. And D. Develop, resource and implement an Indigenous preferred procurement program. Political life recommendation. Recommendation 96. The Victorian Government must negotiate with First Peoples the establishment of a permanent First Peoples representative body with powers at all levels of political and policy decision making. Redress recommendation. Recommendation 99. The Victorian Government must officially acknowledge the responsibility of its predecessors for law, policies and practices that contributed to systemic injustices against Victorian First Peoples. Make official apologies to First Peoples in Victoria, and negotiate with the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria a form of words for official apologies to First People, individuals and community. And I think most importantly is recommendation 100. Through both statewide and traditional owner treaties, the Victorian Government must provide redress for injustice which has occurred during and as a result of colonial invasion and occupation of First Peoples territories and all consequent damage and loss, including economic and non-economic loss for genocide, crimes against humanity, and denial of freedoms. In respect of the redress obligations for the taking of land, water, and resources from First Nations people, the Victorian Government must act consistently with the principle of UNDRIP Articles 8, 2B and 28, including the following. A. Redress for economic loss, including past loss, loss of opportunities, and loss to future generations. B. Interest on economic loss. C. Redress for non-economic loss, including cultural loss assessed at the date of the extinguishment. And D. Interest on non-economic loss. Redress should take form of E. Restoration of traditional lands, waters, and natural resources, ownership rights to First Peoples. F. Monetary compensation. G. Tax relief. And H. such other financial or other benefits as may be requested by the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria or the local treaty bodies in treaty negotiations. So I think from this, I wanted to go through and make sure that we had a really deep understanding on what the report has found, its key findings, and some of its recommendations. I think from this, it's not a surprise for us that these findings have come out. You know, it's not a shocker that genocide, rape, the removal of children, the dispossession from lands, waters, culture occurred. But like I made a point earlier, it is cementing it in quite an official process, and that's a positive. I think for me, being a sort of Republican and wanting to move to a Republican system and shed ourselves from our colonial monarchical background, I think it's important that our head of state, you know, we look at our prime ministers or our premiers at a state and territory level as the heads of state. And I think that we often forget that the king, previously the Queen, is our head of state. And so, you know, if he wants to be our head of state, he should know about this. And, you know, the Yoorrook Justice Commission wrote to him, asked him to participate in the process. He didn't. They've come up with their findings and their recommendations. And so I thought it important to at least let the king know about this. And so I'm just going to read you my letter to His Majesty King Charles III. As one of your subjects, though not by consent, I write to inform you of the findings of the Yoorrook Justice Commission, Australia's first Indigenous-led truth-telling inquiry. It has concluded that genocide was committed against Aboriginal people in Victoria from 1834 onward, not by accident nor in chaos, but through deliberate policy. Massacres, child removal, and systemic erasure of culture and identity. These actions were carried out under laws and structures sanctioned by the Crown. These numbers are stark. By federation, in 1901, Victoria's Aboriginal population had fallen to just 1 to 5% of pre-contact size. The Commission recorded at least 40 massacres across the state in the space of 14 years. Thousands of children were forcibly removed from their families under protection laws that enabled cultural dislocation and generational trauma. The report offers 100 recommendations, from constitutional recognition and redress to the overhaul of school curricula, yet its most important offering is a simple one: the truth. The Commission concluded that these actions constitute genocide, not as a metaphor, as legal and historical facts. This letter is not only mine, it echoes one sent by my third great-grandmother Jane Duran to your great-grandfather King George V on the 14th of June 1926. She wrote on behalf of Aboriginal children in Bateman's Bay who had been excluded from school for months. Why call it a public school, she asked, if it's not public to all? Her letter was stamped by Buckingham Palace. This letter has not been acknowledged. I write now with a simple request. Do not repeat that silence. You are not to blame for this history, but you are its inheritor. With that comes an opportunity, the duty even to speak with honesty and humility. Acknowledgement alone will not undo the past, but it may help us walk into a future where history is no longer ignored and dignity no longer denied. Truth-telling is already underway in the country. It seemed only right the Crown be informed. Respectfully, Harry Stewart, Ewan and Tharawal Man. And for anyone who has not read the newsletter or has not seen the post, if you want to track the letter, the AusPost tracking number is EJ3406968330AU. Like discussed, I don't have much hope that the letter will be responded to. I don't even know if I will get it back with a stamp saying, this letter has not been acknowledged. I hope that I do. For posterity's sake and historical stake and being able to, keep that. But you never know with these things. So moving on to a lighter note, empowering First Nations through vocational training and recognition. The National Indigenous Training Academy, NITA, operated by VOUGE's Indigenous Tourism Australia across its Air Rock Resort and Mossman Gorge Cultural Centres sites, is making significant milestones in empowering First Nations youth through vocational education. Since its establishment in 2011, NITA has supported more than 750 Indigenous Australians to achieve nationally recognised qualifications, including over 650 graduates from its Uluru campus alone. This July, the Academy was announced as a finalist for Small Training Provider of the Year at the 2025 Northern Territory Training Award, an affirmation of its growing stature as a registered training organisation with national impact. Leading the celebration is graduate turned coordinator Kit Hawes, recently honoured as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Student of the Year at the GTNT Group Award, a testament to the life-changing power of culturally grounded education. Matt Cameron-Smith, CEO of the VOUGE's Indigenous Tourism Australia, emphasised that NITA is more than a training academy. It is a launchpad for Indigenous success, instilling skills, confidence, pride and purpose in its graduates. With on-site traineeships delivering Certificate 3 qualifications in hospitality and tourism, NITA continues to forge pathways into meaningful employment, nurturing the next generation of Indigenous leaders in tourism and beyond. And our final story, Turning the Pages, VOUGE Australia champions essential First Nations voices. In a bold cultural move, VOUGE Australia has curated an essential reading list of Indigenous authors, an invitation to elevate First Nations narratives from the page to the national conversation. This isn't a token gesture, it is a commitment to deep listening, learning, and honest reflection. At the heart of the list are seminal works such as Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, a rigorous re-examination of pre-colonial agriculture, and Aboriginal emerging that has reshaped public discourse about what Aboriginal Australia once was, and still is. The anthology also honours Sally Morgan's My Place, a landmark 1987 memoir that traced her journey to uncover her hidden Aboriginal heritage, a book that helped usher Indigenous storytelling into mainstream Australia. Other crucial titles include Alexis Wright's The Swan Book, a chilling futuristic novel confronting climate change and identity, shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award. Melissa Lukanchenko's Mullumbimby brings modern Bundjalung experience into sharp focus, winning the 2013 Queensland Literary Award. These contributions are complemented by powerful work from poets and memoirists, texts that cut across genres and generations, laying bare the lived realities and spiritual connections of First Nations people. VOUGE has notably highlighted this collection as an essential Indigenous Australian reading list, signalling the title's clear editorial intent to guide its readers toward cultural insight. By using its platform to elevate these voices, VOUGE is taking an active role in the ongoing work of reconciliation. As readers turn these pages, they participate in a more inclusive national story, one that honours the resilience, knowledge and creativity of hundreds of thousands of years of First Nations experiences. And that's it for Capital and Country. If you find anything interesting, hit that like button, share it with a friend, or continue the conversation over dinner. This has been Harry Stewart. Yarn to you next time.
And this is my baby Luna. She's a baby.